All right, let's start looking at animation. There are a few different ways to animate things in a panels comic. I can animate the position of a layer, the X and Y properties, and I can have those animate progressively as the user scrolls through a panel, like this hand moving here, or I can have them animate all at once, like the lid on this container. And I can also animate through multiple images on a single layer, having that layer cycle through the frames of animation as the user scrolls. And then there are also some effects that I can apply to a layer, like blinking or shaking, or for text layers having the text type on one character at a time. Let's build a new sequence and look at each of those individually. So I'm just going to quickly create a new sequence here to build some of these animation demos. This won't be part of my final comic. So I've got a sequence with 2 empty panels, and I'll just import that in my main file and add it to my comic data table. And now I have a simple little sequence here to test with. So first, let's look at animating the position of a layer. I'll just paste in some layers so that we have something to work with. So if I export my images to be the full frame of the Playdate screen, then they'll be positioned with the X and Y coordinates at 0, 0 in the top left of the frame. Since that's the default, then I don't need to specify positions for any of these layers. But if I cut my images to be smaller than full frame, or if I just need to adjust something later, I can add that positioning information right here on the layer. So this hand layer will be positioned at -30 on the horizontal X-axis and 100 on the vertical Y-axis. Remember, these coordinates are positioning the top left of the image. So even though I'm setting that position to be -30 out here somewhere and 100 down here somewhere, that's the top left of the image. So the image of the hand itself is over here somewhere. So I've got that layer positioned starting mostly off screen, and I want to animate this hand up into the middle of the screen. And so I can use this same coordinate system to animate this hand image as the panel scrolls. So I'm starting it at Y100, almost halfway down the screen, and I want to animate it up toward the top of the screen. I just need to give it that new Y position to animate to. And I do that just by creating an animate property on this layer. This property should be another table, so I'll use the curly braces. And inside that table, I just need to list any of the properties I want to animate, which would be the Y property in this case, and the value I want to animate that to. So now this layer will start from its initial position, and this is where the layer will be when the edge of this panel first comes onto the screen, and it will animate as the panel scrolls to the position in this animate table. This is the position it will end up at when the other edge of the panel is just barely still visible on the screen. So let's see how that looks. So as I said, right as that panel starts to enter the screen, that's where this panel starts drawing, and that's when this layer will be at that initial position. And as I scroll, we can see that hand layer animates up, and just before that panel leaves the screen is when it will finally reach the position set in this animate table. So you need to gauge those positions a little bit to figure out where you want your layer to be animating when it's mostly visible, because for a lot of this animation, I can't actually see much of that layer. But this animation system works the same for manual and auto-scrolling panels. So if this were an auto-scrolling sequence, you'd see the layer animate to its halfway point when the panel is fully on screen. And then as you transition out of this panel, you'd see it quickly animate to its final position. And I can even animate multiple properties just by adding them to this animate table. So if I want to animate a little bit on the horizontal axis as well, I can just add the X property to specify where I want to animate that to. And remember, if I don't include this initial X property, it will just start animating from the default position, which is 0. One thing to note, though, is that it works best to animate a layer in the opposite direction of the scroll. So since this sequence scrolls horizontally, then a vertical animation works best. I can still animate on the x-axis, as I just did, but since the layer will also be scrolling horizontally and be sliding horizontally based on the parallax setting, it can get a bit weird sometimes trying to animate something along that same axis without it looking strange. But you can always try it out and see what kind of results you get. So now we have this layer set up to animate across the screen based on the scroll position. That means the animation speed changes to match the speed that I'm scrolling through this panel. And if I scroll backward, the animation also reverses. In a lot of cases, that's exactly what I want, but sometimes I want to have a layer do a quick animation when the user hits a button or when they first scroll the panel into the screen. If I want to do that, then I would use a time-based animation instead of this scroll-based animation. Let me add a new panel to illustrate that. So in this panel, I want the lid on this little box to slide away when this panel comes onto screen. In this case, I want the animation to start from 0, 0, which is, again, the default position, so I don't need to specify that. And I want to animate it to -66x and 160y. But if I use a scroll-based animation for this, you can see first, I don't ever get a good shot of the lid when it's closed. And I also can't really see when it's fully open because by the time that animation completes, the frame is almost completely off the screen. So to change this to a time-based animation, I use the same animate property with a table that contains the properties and values that I want to animate to. Remember, I'm starting from the default. And then I just need to add another property to specify the duration of this animation. How long I want it to take to animate the layer from its initial position to the position specified here. That value is in milliseconds. So if I want this to animate over half a second, I can set the duration to 500 milliseconds. Now, by default, this is going to start animating as soon as this panel starts to appear on the screen, which means you're probably not going to see it animate because it will start animating the instant that first edge of the panel enters the screen, and it will be done in half a second. So it'll be done most likely before this layer even scrolls into view. There are a couple things I can do to try to fix that problem. I could add a delay to this animation. This will delay the start of this animation by a certain number of milliseconds. That might be a good fix for an auto-scrolling sequence, but since this is manually scrolling, then you still don't know how long it will take for the layer to come into view. The user could scroll really slowly and still not have the layer in view when the animation is triggered, or they could scroll by really fast and be past the panel before this animation even starts. So what I really want to do is set a scroll trigger for this. With a scroll trigger, I define the scroll position for this panel at which the animation should start. So this value goes from 0 to 1. 0 is when the panel is just about to enter the screen, and 1 is as the panel scrolls off the screen entirely. So the halfway point when the panel is fully on screen would be 0.5, and values in between would give you those in-between positions. I want this animation to trigger just as the panel comes fully into view, so I set mine to 0.5. And now I can see that no matter how slowly or quickly I scroll, the layer stays at that initial position until I hit the halfway point when it's fully visible, and then I see it quickly performs that animation. So both of these are performing animations on a single layer in my panel, but I can also animate between multiple images on the same layer if I want to have more of a frame-by-frame animation or just a simple image switch from one to the other. And the easiest way to do that is by creating a layer with multiple images instead of just a single image. So instead of listing a single image using the image property, I can use the images with an S property, and that property expects a list of images. So for this, I just use curly braces and then a comma separated list of the paths to the images I want to use. So if I take a look at these images I've listed here, we can see I have a sequence of images for that layer that will simulate that vine growing out of the pot. And just like with the position animation, by default, this is based on the scroll position of the panel. So this layer will transition between these different images as I scroll. So if I have 2 images listed here, the transition will happen at the halfway point. If I have 3, the transition will happen at 1/3 scroll and 2/3 scroll, and so on. Let's just preview this quickly. So you can see as I scroll, I transition between those images. And all those images are on a single layer with a single parallax value. And a trick I like to use here is that I can have something appear or disappear from screen just by adding a blank, fully transparent image to this list. So adding a blank image at the beginning will show nothing until I scroll a certain distance, and then it will transition to the next image and then the next. The other way to do a frame-based animation would be to use an image table instead of a list of images. So I can load an animated GIF or an image table image, which is like a sprite sheet, and have that appear just like a normal layer. Panels even has properties to control the frame rate, the trigger, and whether you want that to loop or not. You can find that information in the documentation. And then the last way to do animations in panels is by using layer effects. There are 2 effects that can be applied to any layer, blink and shake, and there's also a typing on effect that obviously only applies to text layers. So in this panel here, I have a scene that has this dark layer that I want to blink on and off to simulate that this light bulb is failing. To do that, I'll add an effect to this layer called darken. This property, again, takes a table, and in this table, I need to define the type of effect that I want to use, which is blink in my case. And the other properties that I use here depend on which type of effect I'm using. So for blink, I can define the durations for how long to blink the layer on and how long to keep it off. I want this to flash pretty rapidly, so I'll set it to be on for just 50 milliseconds and to be off for twice as long. And this will create a pretty intense blink effect. The Playdate has a nice accessibility setting to reduce flashing in the system, and I want to respect that if the user has that setting enabled, so I can define a separate set of durations to be used if that setting is turned on the device. This way I can define a much slower, less intense blink to be used when users have that setting turned on. To do that, I just need to use the reduce flashing durations property. That will give me a much milder effect when that setting is enabled. So that's a quick overview of all the ways that you can animate layers in panels. And the cool thing is I can combine all of these if I want. So I could have a layer moving across the screen with a position animation, and also have that layer changing to different images as you scroll with the frame-based animation. You could even put a shake or a blink effect on that same layer, so it would be animating in 3 ways. So you could see how you could get some pretty complex looking animations just by defining a few extra properties on your layer.